The same is true with climate. When I made the announcement in Beijing with President Xi, I was able to do so in part because we had led domestically. So I could put my money where my mouth was, and I said, here are the tough political decisions we're making, now what are you going to do? And once we were able to get China involved, that gave confidence to other countries that we were in. A position to make a difference as well, or that they needed to be involved in the process as well. So whether it's organizing the coalition that's fighting ISIL, or dealing with climate change, our role is central, but on large international issues like this. It's not going to be sufficient, at least not if we want it to take, if we want it to sustain itself. We've got to have partners. And that's the kind of leadership that we should aspire to. With respect to Planned Parenthood, obviously my heart goes out to the families of those impacted. I mean, Nancy, I say this every time we've got one of these. Mass shootings. This just doesn't happen in other countries. We are, rightly, determined to prevent terrorist attacks wherever they occur. Whether in the United States or with friends and allies like France. And we devote enormous resources, and properly so, to rooting out networks and debilitating organizations like ISIL. And maintaining the intelligence and improving the information sharing that can identify those who would try to kill innocent people. And yet, in the United States, we have the power to do more to prevent what is. Just a regular process of gun homicides that is unequaled by multiples of 5, 6. And I think the American people understand that. So my hope is that, once again, this spurs a conversation and action. And I will continue to present those things that I can do administratively. But in the end of the day, Congress, states, local governments are going to have to act in order to make sure that we're preventing people who are deranged or have violent tendencies from getting weapons that can magnify the damage that they do. And with respect to Planned Parenthood, I think it's clear, I've said it before, they provide health services to women all across the country. Have for generations. In many cases. It's the only organization that provides health services to impoverished women. And I think it's fair to have a legitimate, honest debate about abortion. I don't think that's something that is beyond the pale of our political discussion. I think it's a serious, legitimate issue. How we talk about it, making sure that we're talking about it factually, accurately. And not demonizing organizations like Planned Parenthood, I think, is important. Jeff Mason. Question, thank you, Mr. President. Do you believe that Turkey is doing enough to strengthen its northwest border with Syria? How is it that a NATO country with as large a military as Turkey has not sealed its border? And is that something that you raised today with President Erdogan? And then, to put a finer point on the climate change question, can leaders gathered here believe that the United States will keep its commitments? Even after you've left office, if a Republican succeeds you in the White House? President Obama, just with respect to my successor, let me. First of all, say that I'm anticipating a Democrat succeeding me. I'm confident in the wisdom of the American people on that front. But even if somebody from a different party succeeded me, one of the things that you find is when you're in this job, you think about it differently than when you're just running for the job. And what you realize is what I mentioned earlier, that American leadership involves not just playing to a narrow constituency back home. But you now are, in fact, at the center of what happens around the world. And that your credibility and America's ability to influence events depends on taking seriously what other countries care about. Now, the fact of the matter is there's a reason why you have the largest. Gathering of world leaders probably in human history here in Paris. Everybody else is taking climate change really seriously. They think it's a really big problem. It spans political parties. You travel around Europe. And you talk to leaders of governments and the opposition. And they are arguing about a whole bunch of things. One thing they're not arguing about is whether the science of climate change is real and whether or not we have to do something about it. So whoever is the next president of the United States, if they come in and they suggest somehow that global Consensus: not just 99.5% of scientists and experts, but 99% of world leaders think this is really important. I think the President of the United States is going to need to think this is really important. And that's why it's important for us to not project what's being said on a campaign trail. But to do what's right, and make the case. And I would note that the American people, I think in the most recent survey, two-thirds of them said America should be a signatory to any agreement that emerges that is actually addressing climate change in a serious way. So the good news is, the politics inside the United States is changing, as well. Sometimes it may be hard for Republicans to support something that I'm doing. But that's more a matter of the games Washington plays. And that's why I think people should be confident that we'll meet our commitments on this. With respect to Turkey, I have had repeated conversations with President Erdogan about the need to close the border between Turkey and Syria. We've seen some serious progress on that front, but there are still some gaps. In particular, there's about 98 kilometers that are still used as a transit point for foreign fighters. ISIL shipping out fuel for sale that helps finance their terrorist activities. And so we have been having our militaries work together to determine how a combination of air and Turkish ground forces on the Turkish side of the border can do a much better job of sealing the border than currently is. And I think President Erdogan recognizes that. I'm also encouraged by the fact that President Erdogan and the EU had a series of meetings around Or Turkey and the EU had a series of meetings around the issue of the Turkish-Greek border. We have to remind ourselves, Turkey has taken on an enormous humanitarian effort. There are millions of Syrians who are displaced and living inside of Turkey, not just refugee camps. But they are now moving into major cities throughout Turkey. That puts enormous strains on their infrastructure, on their housing, on employment. And Turkey has continued to keep those borders open for people in real need. So I'm proud that the United States is the single largest contributor of humanitarian aid for Syrian refugees. I'm glad that the EU is looking to do more to help Turkey manage those refugee flows. But I also think the EU, rightly, wants to see the kind of orderly process along the Turkish-Greek. Border that's necessary for Europe to be able to regulate the amount of refugees it's absorbing. And to save the lives of refugees who are oftentimes taking enormous risks because they're being ferried back and forth by human traffickers who are now operating in the same ways that you see drug traffickers operating under at enormous profit, and without regard for human life. Question: did you raise the border issue with him today? President Obama, we talked about it today, but I guess what I'm saying. Jeff, is this has been an ongoing conversation. We recognize that this is a central part of our anti-ISIL strategy. We've got to choke them off. We have to choke off how they make money. We've got to choke off their ability to bring in new fighters. Because we've taken tens of thousands of their fighters off the battlefield, but if new ones are still coming in, then they continue to maintain a stranglehold over certain population centers inside of Iraq or Syria. So we've got to cut off their source of new fighters. That's also part of the great danger for Europe, and ultimately the United States. As well, and countries as far-flung as Australia or Singapore. If you've got foreign fighters coming in that are getting not only ideologically hardened but battle hardened, and then they're returning to their home countries, they're likely candidates for engaging in the kind of terrorist attacks that we saw here in Paris. So this has been ongoing concern, and we're going to continue to push hard among all our allies to cut off the financing. Cut off the foreign fighters, improve our intelligence gathering. Which has allowed us to accelerate the strikes that we're taking against ISIL. A lot of the discussion over the last couple of weeks was the pace of airstrikes. The pace of airstrikes is not constrained by the amount of planes or missiles that we have. The pace has been dictated by how many effective targets do we have. And our intelligence continues to improve. And the better we get at that, the better we're going to be at going after them. Scott Horsley. Question, thank you, Mr. President. In terms of sending that market signal you talked about today and a couple of times this week. I wonder if you see any political path back home towards putting an explicit price on carbon.